Welcome to Uncolored. I'm Kevin Metcalf. Thanks for coming back. This is going to be fun what we're going to do this week. We're going to look at another video and just give a bit of a critique on a video. It's this one here by this young man on the left. His name is Jordan Hatfield. And the guy on the right, his name is Dave Vandervelde, I believe it is. It's from a channel called Great Light Studios, run by the young man on the left, Jordan Hatfield. If I understand correctly, Jordan used to be in this thing called Calvanism, but has since gotten out of Calvinism. And much of the content on his channel is dedicated to talking about that very thing. And he's fortunate enough to get David Vandervelde, the guy on the right there, who is a self-proclaimed, he says, I'm a 5-point Calvinist. Now, the reason why I picked this is not to pick on anybody. Obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but I just want to make that clear. I like to critique ideas. And unfortunately, if you're going to critique an idea, you have to, go through the person who holds that idea. And that's all that's going on here. Both of them seem like fine gentlemen, and I commend what they're trying to do. Now, if you look in the comment section of the video, people love this, or at least appreciated the attempt to have a conversation about what to many people is a controversial issue, but do it in a way that's not contentious. And that's very important, and it should be commended, because there's all kinds of people yelling and screaming at each other, taking cheap shots, and that's not really what you want to go for. But I found this video very frustrating to watch because here's the thing about interviews like this. Typically, this kind of interview, it's not just two people getting together just to kind of, talk about whatever and wherever the conversation goes. They're both here for a very specific reason to talk about a very specific topic. So this would be better classified as an interview or a conversation about something. Now, these are very rare. Most people don't want to talk about important ideas, especially from different perspectives. So when you have the opportunity to do that, it is an information-rich situation. There's tons of information because you have somebody who's looking at the same thing that you're looking at, and they're seeing different things. So it's a great opportunity to find out, what are they seeing that you're not seeing? What's going on? You can't miss it. It doesn't happen all the time. And so what I was hoping for was more engagement on particular topics. Now, Jordan gave his best effort, I think, in the beginning, but it didn't quite go that well, and I understand why. And we'll talk about that. But I do think that there were some very good opportunities to really get into the topic and dig deep into the details of the topic, because that's where all the good information is. But instead, they were kind of glossed over. And we'll talk about those too. But just as an example of what I'm talking about, and I hate telling stories like this, but it so fits this thing. So back when I was a young cop, brand new, I worked closely with a veteran cop. Guy was fantastic. And he initiated a search warrant at this resident. He had information. And so he and I and a few other officers were there just going through the whole place trying to find what we were looking for. After several hours, found nothing. So as we're collecting ourselves, getting ready to go, this officer that I'm working with, he looks on the side of the house, and it's a detached garage with a fence right next to the garage. And in between the side of the garage and the fence, this little row, just a row of plants, just nondescript plants. Well, this officer I'm working with, he kept looking at it and he goes, there's something wrong with that. And I'm looking and I'm not seeing anything. And he says, look at that row of plants and then look at the rest of this yard. And as I looked, again, not really seeing, I'm a young cop and kind of dumb. Of course, not much has changed. But he said, the row of plants is pristine, no debris. It looks like somebody's been taking very good care of those plants. When you look at the rest of the yard, total chaos. And he said that doesn't match. There's something wrong. Now, is it possible that there was really nothing suspicious about it? Maybe whoever lived there was somebody there for whom that area was like their little oasis in all of the chaos that was going on, and they just loved plants? Sure, that's possible. But the point is, unless we looked to find out, we would have never known. And sure enough, he starts digging into those plants. Boom. One of the biggest cases of his career. And I'll tell you what, if you ask any cop, talk to any cop you know, they'll tell you most of the biggest incidents that they've ever been involved in started out with somebody looking at something and going, that doesn't make sense. There's something wrong with that. Can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something wrong going over there. And once you start investigating, all kinds of stuff pops out. And hopefully I'll be able to illustrate to you that looking at this video. But first, what I want to do is again, I want to make it clear, not against anybody here, and I do want to give these guys credit, because this is a very difficult thing to do, is to sit in front of somebody, especially in this sort of venue, and talk about ideas that you disagree on. So you got to give them credit, both of them, Dave and Jordan, for showing up to do this thing, and I want to make that clear. I also appreciate the effort they got into or tried to make, so this wasn't some contentious, nonsensical thing. But again, the problem with interviews like this is, obviously, if it gets too contentious, you lose the flow of information. And that's all you're there for. Not to be right, not to make the other person look bad. You're just trying to get the information. But the other problem with that is, far from having the information flow shut down in a contentious interview, if it gets too light and friendly, then in an attempt to keep the friendly atmosphere, sometimes you don't press on issues that need to be pressed. And I think that's kind of what happened here. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that isn't what happened, but that's the impression that I got. So in this point, this is a very great thing that Jordan is doing. He's trying to define terms, because Calvinism, again, it's not a monolithic idea, and there are different variations of Calvinism. So Jordan's taking the time here to define terms and clarify where Dave was coming from. And I think this is fantastic.
Huge. And so could you give us an idea of where do you land on this spectrum? You have John Piper, I think maybe somewhat tongue in cheek, but he'll say he's a 7-point Calvinist. And so you do have 4-point, you have various forms of it. So where, I guess, would you land on this?
Well, it's funny you sent me the text calling Piper a 7-point Calvinist, and I never heard that before, so I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that. That was kind of funny. But I consider myself a 5-point Calvinist, but how are we defining those terms is critical, because I think when you begin to unpack it, first of all, I think the TULIP acronym is not helpful. I think that creates division right away, because they're trying to force an idea into a letter or a word that isn't really, I don't think, unpacking it very well.
Now, so you see right off the bat, there's sort of, not going to say drawing lines, that's not the right way to say it, but they're just talking about where they are with this idea called Calvinism. And I think Dave said a couple of excellent things. One is that the acronym TULIP is not helpful, and I agree. I think it's a bad idea. Don't even want to get into it, but I agree with him there. He also mentions that he was unfamiliar with John Piper saying that he was a 7-point Calvinist. Now, again, one of the things that I found when I was listening to Dave is that he's like a lot of people or many people in Calvinism who want to say, I'm a Calvinist. But when you start to ask them about their Calvinism, it turns out that they're not really Calvinists. But they, for whatever reason, want to hold on to that particular name. But again, I appreciate him. He's being very forward, very honest about where he is, and understands that you can get the picture in the beginning that there's a lot about Calvinism that he doesn't agree with, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that. But it was a perfect point where Jordan and Dave were trying to get a higher resolution on where they stand with this idea. And that's a perfect way to start out a conversation. So this is going to be Dave, again, giving a little bit more of his ideas about Calvinism. And I just think it's important to get a little bit of where he's coming from, just so you can get the flavor of the conversation going forward.
Mm-hmm. To unpack exactly where I stand. I believe, to also use a word that I don't think I've ever heard spoken in church, is determinism. How God determines everything to come to pass. I believe he does. I don't believe he's the author of sin. He is not happy about evil or sin.
So this is one of a sticking point in Calvinism that, again, Calvinists will say that God is in control of everything, and the term control needs to be unpacked. It needs to be looked at in a higher resolution. Because while Dave says he's never heard determinism spoken in church, which is fine, but there are a lot of words that people use that mean determinism, and for the Calvinist, it's sovereignty. For the Calvinist, sovereignty equals determinism. And so when they're talking about the sovereignty of God, they're talking about determinism, generally speaking. And they're usually talking about hard determinism. So, because Dave has never heard the term determinism, he hasn't put those two things together. But that's okay. He's simply telling you where he's coming from. And there's nothing wrong with that.
However, in his decree, he allows it. And I think there are very clear indications in God's word that show that.
So I wanted to play that point too, because again, it's important to understand that where Dave's coming from, he's not coming from a point of hard determinism. He's coming from a point of I don't know if it's called soft determinism, but it's that things are determined, but they're determined in a non-deterministic way. It's very complicated. We're going to get into that next week. But for right now, just understand there's a hard determinism where every single thing is determined by God. And then there's a not hard determinism where some things are determined by God, but other things are kind of left up to humans or whatever else would cause those things to happen. Dave seems to hold the opinion that it's a not hard determinism. It's more of a soft determinism where God determines some things, but there are other things that happen that he doesn't determine, but allows for those things to happen. And it's very important to understand where he's coming from. And I'm glad and this part of it, fantastic. And let me say this. While I, again, understand Calvinism is not a monolithic idea, but for Dave to say I'm a 5-point Calvinist, but it seems that he rejects hard determinism for some sort of softer determinism. And to be either unaware of or disagree with many of the ideas behind Calvinism that really all stem from the determinism, it seems to me, generally speaking. That's where I get the idea that I'm not quite sure that he really understands what Calvinism is or the ideas that he's saying accurately represent the world. It would be kind of like if you ran into somebody who goes, I'm a plumber, full certified plumber, and you go, oh, wow, that's fantastic. Maybe you can come to my house, I got a water heater problem, and I call you and you come help me with the water heater. And then the guy goes, well, I actually don't work on pipes. As a matter of fact, I really don't understand how the whole water system works in a home, but I'm a plumber. You see the problem. Then the name suddenly doesn't really mean a whole lot. If you're going to say, I'm a plumber, but the things that a plumber does, you really don't do or agree with. I think it's the same thing with Calvinism oftentimes. Many people who are confronted with Calvinism qua Calvin reject the ideas and try to find some softer form that doesn't go along with Calvin's ideas, but they still want to call themselves Calvinists, and which is fine. But again, I'm not quite sure what you're trying to do at that point. If you're going to go, I reject what Calvin says, but I'm a Calvinist. Matter of fact, some of the stronger Calvinists, what they'll do is, like Jeff Durbin, I believe, did this, where they'll tell you, I've never even read Calvin, right? Which, okay, I mean, if that's where you're going to go. But what they're trying to do is not tell you that they don't understand Calvinism or they don't adhere or disagree or agree with Calvin's ideas. What they're trying to do, in my opinion, is distance themselves from Calvin's ideas. Because, again, most people, like Dave, when they encounter the things that Calvin said, they reject those ideas. And I think what a lot of people do are who say we're strong Calvinists but say I've never read Calvin, is to distance themselves from the objectionable ideas that people understand Calvin had. That's what I think is going on. But for Dave, I just think he just doesn't know. Which, again, that's why I say I don't think he's either new to Calvinism, or he just hasn't really thought about the ideas and the implications, or have done enough research. And it just seems to me, if you're going to say this is a picture of the real world, you should have done your homework. So when somebody says, well, this is one of the things that the people you say who have this opinion or crafted this picture of the world, this is what they say. And if you say, I've never heard it before, I don't understand it, or I don't believe it, then again, the question I would have is, why are you even calling yourself a Calvinist if you don't agree with his ideas and haven't heard of most of them? Now, here's another point where I think Jordan does an excellent thing to, again, try to get clarity, because they touched on the concept of determinism, control, allow, author, those kinds of things are all surrounding people's understanding of determinism. And so Jordan is now going to try and get a little bit deeper into the details and bring in this concept a little bit more clearly on where they both understand.
To kind of, again, just so we can understand where each other are coming from here. And I would even wonder, based off some of what you've just said, because I heard you using the word allow a couple times, which I think is a word that would not even be able to be used in John Piper's, for example, his vocabulary related to God's sovereignty. I think he would not ever use the word. I mean, he might use the word allow, but if you really get to the foundations of what he's saying, I think he would make sure to clarify that what he means is yes, God decisively causes, ordains all things. There is really, the word allow isn't the best, most accurate way of thinking about it. So if it's all right with you, I wanted to just read.
So again, fantastic job. What Jordan does here is just bring up the point that while Dave says that God is in control, when you bring up the word allow, there's a conflict among Calvinists using those kinds of terminology, because allow for many Calvinists means that God is not in control, that somebody else is doing something that God is not in control of, but he'll allow it. And for the harder determinists in Calvinism, that's verboten. You can't do that. And I think Jordan's just bringing that point up, and I think it's fantastic.
I'm going to read a couple quotes. So one quote is from Desiring God's webpage. I don't think this was John Piper himself, but it's somebody on the Desiring God page who, is part of that ministry, and who they're endorsing, obviously, by posting this guy's sermon and his writings, the things that were said. So I'm going to read this, and maybe this might help, because we can both answer, do we agree with what was just said or not? So, quote, God brings about all things in accordance with his will. In other words, it isn't just that God manages to turn the evil aspects of our world to good for those who love him. It is rather that he himself brings about these evil aspects for his glory and his people's good. This includes, as incredible and as unacceptable as it may currently seem, God's having even brought about the Nazis' brutality at Birkenau, don't know if I'm saying that right, and Auschwitz, as well as the terrible killings of Dennis Rader and even the sexual abuse of a young child. So again...
So just to be clear, this Mark Talbot guy, who apparently is a Calvinist, who writes on a website called Desiring God, which is a Calvinist website, if I understand correctly, I think the point Jordan's making here is that if you're in the Calvinist world, hard determinism is the way to go. And this idea of God allowing stuff, again, is verboten in the strict Calvinist term, which seems to indicate that Dave is either new to his Calvinism or he doesn't quite understand Calvinism. And that's the impression I get from Dave. He's either new to it or doesn't really understand Calvinism, or just really isn't concerned with it, just likes being call himself a Calvinist, whatever it is. But when Jordan presents Dave with these kinds of things, these writings from people who are Calvinists, Dave seems to either not know them, doesn't understand them, or thinks it's some kind of a mystery. But it's curious because this here, what Jordan just read by Mark Talbot, is going to be almost exactly what Dave is going to bring up later on, that he says he affirms. And we'll get to that in a second. But right here, this is just Talbot saying this is what he thinks Calvinism is, and it aligns with many of the stronger Calvinists. And Jordan wants to get Dave's opinion on it.
And he's saying, end quote there, but he's saying it's not only that God, takes these evil circumstances, these things that play out due to man's decisions, and takes those things and then turns them to good. It's actually that God is kind of at the beginning making sure that these evil things will unchangeably, definitely come about.
And that's, again, hard determinism. There are zero things that occur that God doesn't actively make happen. That's what the decree means. That's what author means. That's what, there's another word and I just slipped my mind. But that's what they're talking about. It's a hard determinism. So there's no room for allow in the strong Calvinist camp. That's the only point that Jordan's pointing out here.
And so I guess, would you, having heard that, and maybe you'd want a little bit more time to look at it, but just offhand, what's your kind of initial response or reaction to that? Is that something you would agree with? Would you have some disagreement with anything there?
I think I wouldn't say it quite so strongly. I think I would stick with the word allow, but within the word allow, you do have to understand that by allowing it, he's still in control. So I think that's probably what Piper's trying to say. And I think also I've heard other people try to explain this. I'm really not going to drop names. I know we joked about that before. Yeah. And I don't want to attack Piper. I like Piper, but I think I think I would have worded it maybe differently. But I'm not a theologian. In the word allow, God is still in control of that event.
So now I got to be honest. I agree with Dave. But again, the point that I think Jordan is making is that's not a Calvinist position. That would be a non-Calvinist position. I think, like Dave just said, God does control certain things. There are certain things that he makes happen. But I think there's a lot of things that God doesn't make happen. And I think just to make that clear, let me get you to a verse that I was going to read later, but I think it works now when it talks about this control. Because again, the extreme or 5-point or whatever point Calvinist, the harder Calvinism tells you that there are zero things that happen that aren't in God's control or that he doesn't actually make happen. So for control for them means determinism. But for people like me, and it sounds like people like Dave, there are a lot of things that happen that God doesn't make happen. And just to get some objective data on this, take a look at this. It's here in Jeremiah 19, and I think it's 5. Let me see if I can find it. Okay. We'll start in verse 4. Because the people have forsaken me and have profaned this place by making offerings to other gods, whom neither they nor their fathers nor the kings of Judah have known. And because they filled this place with the blood of innocents and have built the high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire and burnt offerings to Baal. Now, this is a problem, I think, for someone who is a hard determinist, speaking theolistically, and I just messed that up. Hold on. Which I did not command, decree, nor did it come into my mind. Now, it seems to me that that's God saying that these horrific things that people are doing, I had nothing to do with it. Didn't decree it. I didn't plan it. I didn't command it. It never came into my mind. So that seems a problem for people who say that God controls everything and that there is nothing that happens that God does not ordain. That seems to be a problem. Now, that didn't come up, and there's no problem with that because, again, another thing you have to remember, and I'm aware of, is In these kind of conversations, information's going back and forth, and you're trying to think of what you want to say or trying to, analyze or understand what somebody else has said. So when the information's going back and forth, there are a lot of things that when you look back on the conversation, you go, boy, I wish I would have said this, or I wish I would have went to this piece of data and brought that in. So you're not going to catch every opportunity to examine things. So again, I want to make that clear because I don't want to be too critical of these guys. I think both of them are doing a fantastic job. But the point I'm making is, at this point, we have Jordan presenting Calvinism qua Calvin to Dave, and Dave doesn't seem to be on board with Calvinism qua Calvin. That's what I've gleaned so far at this point. So again, they're just going back and forth on the concept of allowing something or control, and how does that work with the determinism and the statements, or Calvinism qua Calvin, where God seems to be a hard determinist.
That's a problem. I'll grant you, there's a problem there that, there's questions that raises. Why did he do that? But I think just initially there's an apparent difference between God allowing it and God, in a very real sense, being the one who's actually doing the murdering or causing the murdering, And so I think that's why I think there is, and what I'm going to read here in a minute, the next quote from John Calvin, he even will kind of push back on Calvinists using the word allow as if that actually makes sense within the systematic. So, okay. So sorry to cut you off. I think that's something that I think there's just even on a surface level, there's a moral difference there. Even okay. Though, yes, I would admit there's problems that arise from both allowing or causing, but I think just objectively to directly cause the evil, to say he decisively causes it, is just even on a basic surface level is apparently, I think, objectively worse.
And so here again, Jordan is just simply bringing up, again, gently, that there might be a conflict between saying allow, but at the same thing that God is in control of everything, or at least authors all of the events of mankind, that there might be a problem there. And here is Dave's response.
Okay, so let me just address that quickly. So I think what you're doing is you're trying to frame up an idea that's a finite temporal analogy of an infinite, holy, all-powerful God.
So what you just heard was the appeal to mystery. And this is a common refrain for not just people in Calvinism, but in science you get the same thing. They call it a brute fact. And the idea is that there are these two things that we think are true, or there's a conflict between these two ideas. And because I don't understand it, for the theist, that must mean it's true. It's just an infinite truth, meaning only God can understand how this conflict, this contradiction, could possibly exist. Now, again, that's something that I reject. I don't know how, infinite time or being infinite would make 2 + 2 = 7. It seems like if there's a conflict here in finite time, I don't know how an infinite time would make it no longer a conflict. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm saying I just don't know how that would be, or I don't know why I would believe that. But that's where Dave is.
Temporal analogy of an infinite, holy, all-powerful God. And I think that's a difficult thing to do because we do not see eternity. We only see an event in time with our eyes. And how that plays out in eternity is something we just cannot get our head around.
So you can see in the beginning, I think both of them did a very good job. The trouble that I saw was the things or the ideas that Jordan was presenting to Dave. Dave either never heard of, didn't believe, thought it was too strong, or thought mystery was the explanation, some sort of, infinite mystery was the explanation. Now, for the first two, I don't believe it or I reject it. It's very difficult to pursue any line of questioning that's going to get you information back. If they don't believe something or reject something. If it's mystery that they use as an answer for why they believe something, it is still very difficult to get information from there because, again, if it's mystery, what are you going to do? So I understand that in the beginning, the conversation didn't go too far. At least for me, I just, basically just heard things that I've heard before in these kinds of conversations. So now I want to get to the point where I thought some opportunities were missed. And in this point, Dave is going to bring up a confession that he thinks is an accurate reflection of reality. And this is important because when people are presenting their ideas, it's one thing to say that this is true. That's fantastic. But when they give you some objective piece of data that you can now look at and analyze and get into the details of, that's even better. Because now you can compare what they say the idea is against some piece of hard data. And that's what you're looking for. And that's what Dave presents. The other great thing about Dave presenting this particular piece of data that he's going to show you is that he can't say, I don't believe it, because he's telling you he believes it. It's not an issue of he rejects it, because he's telling you not only believes it, but he thinks this is an accurate way the world is. So the first two are out. He believes it, he doesn't reject it. Now, the mystery part, it's still in play. We don't know how they're going to explain it, but that could still possibly happen. But it's a fertile ground for investigation because they at least say, I understand it, and I believe it, and I think you should believe it this way too. That's why they're holding up their picture of reality, saying that's what reality actually is. So let's see what happens.
A little bit differently. So I'll just kind of stop where I think it's appropriate. So we believe that the same God, after he had created all things, did not forsake them, nor give them up to fortune or to chance, but that he rules and governs according to his holy will, so that nothing happens in the world without his appointment. Nevertheless, God neither is the author of, nor can he ever be charged with the sins that are committed. For his power and goodness are so great and incomprehensible that he orders and executes his work in the most excellent and just manner, even when devils and wicked men act unjustly. I just thought that's just a great summary of how we should think of this.
So you heard Dave read his confession. And then as he ended it, he said, I think that's a great summary of how we should think about this. So we know he affirms it. Apparently he understands it. So now this is a good place to go, okay, let's look a little bit deeper. Let's dig into this and pull back some of these layers. Let's read it one more time just so you can see. And I've taken the time, believe it or not, I got slides, believe it or not. So let's take a look at this because I took the time to pull this apart so we can take a closer examination of it. Okay, here we go. This is the Belgian confession that Dave believes is an accurate representation of the real world, at least with regard to theism. It says, we believe that the same God, after he created all things, did not forsake them or give them up to further chance, but that he rules and governs them according to his holy will, so that nothing happens in this world without his appointment. Nevertheless, God neither is the author of, nor can be charged with the sins which are committed, for his power and goodness are so great and incomprehensible that he orders and executes his work in the most excellent and just manner, even then when devils and wicked men act unjustly. Okay? Now, what I did was I took the liberty of breaking this up into a few different ideas because I see 3 ideas in this little thing here. Okay? So you've got the first part where it says, we believe that the same God, right? That's the first part, okay? That's what I'm calling the premise. So let's take a look at the premise. We believe that the same God, after he'd created all things, did not forsake them or give them up to fortune or chance, but that he rules and governs them according to his holy will. And here's the part that's very key. So that nothing happens in this world without his appointment. Okay? That's hard determinism. It rules out anything called allowed. Just that's a strict logical understanding of that last part, so that nothing happens in this world without his appointment. So why do I say that this equals hard determinism? Okay, I'm going to give you 3 examples that I think will explain this. The first one is you go to the dentist. Okay, the only reason you would ever go to the dentist or be at the dentist is because you made an appointment. You can't just walk into the dentist and go, hey, can you look at my teeth? You have to make an appointment. So that means you're responsible for the fact that you're at the dentist at that time and the dentist is doing something to you. Now, I don't think you can make the argument that you're responsible for what the dentist is doing. That's up to him. You're allowing the dentist to do whatever he does, right? The dentist does a great job. If he does a bad job, you're not responsible for that. But you're responsible for the fact that the dentist is doing anything to you at all, because the only way that could happen is if you made the appointment. So it'd be hard to argue that the dentist is doing something to you and you have no responsibility for the fact that the dentist is doing something to you, okay? But let's say you go, that's not the same thing. Fine. Let's say that you're a boss or a manager at some organization, and there's a position that needs to be filled or some job that somebody needs to do. So you grab somebody and go, hey, guess what? That's your job now. I need you to do that. You just made an appointment. You appointed a person to some office, and you're hoping that they're going to execute that office the way it needs to be done. Now, if they do a great job and somebody comes to you and says, hey, you did a great job by appointing that person, you're taking some of the responsibility for the person being there, not necessarily for what they do, but for the fact that they're there in the first place. You do deserve some responsibility for that. Now, if they're doing something bad, same thing. You may not be responsible for the bad things that they are doing, but you're certainly responsible for them being in that position, okay? So there's some responsibility there. But those 2 examples of a more soft determinism. Some things are appointed by you, but the things that happen while you're there aren't necessarily your responsibility. That's not what's going on in this little story here, this confession. We believe that the same God, after he created all things, did not forsake them or give them up to fortune or chance, but that he rules and governs them according to his holy will, so that nothing happens in this world without his appointment. Okay? That leaves 0 things to ever occur that God did not appoint. This is an example that fits that. You're writing a report, a paper for school, for your job or whatever, okay? Every letter in that report is appointed by you to be there in the exact place that it is in. And so when you hand it in, if you did a great job, you're responsible for every single thing in that report because you appointed each letter to be there. If it's a bad report, guess what? You're responsible because there are 0 things in that report that you didn't put there. That's what this thing is saying, okay? It doesn't leave the room for allow. You can't just say, well, I did most of the report, but I just allowed some of the letters to kind of just get on there wherever they wanted to. Once you go with hard determinism, as this statement that this young man wrote, or this confession that Dave seems to think is an accurate depiction of how the world is, leaves 0 room for allow. And that's why I say, I don't think Dave really understands his idea. I don't think he really understands Calvinism. He seems to advocate something that's a more soft determinism. The hard determinism that typifies Calvinism, he doesn't believe. It doesn't seem like it. But again, that's up to him. No problem. Let's continue, because again, there's more in this particular this statement. So we've got the premise. What's the next part? Well, this is the assertion made because of the premise. Now, here's a question. Why would you even have that second part? Right? If the first part is true, we believe that the same God created all things and did not forsake them, but gave them up to fortune or chance, but that he rules and governs them according to his holy will, so that nothing happens in this world without his appointment. Well, what do you need anything else for? That's pretty clear. God makes everything happen. Well, here's why. Because the natural conclusion of that is that God is a hard determinist. And if God is a hard determinist, then even the bad things occur because he made them happen. That's the natural way to think about it. So they have to put in this second part their assertion that nevertheless, God is neither the author of nor can be charged with the sins that are committed, okay? That's like you turn it in your report and it's a terrible report and you're going, I got nothing to do with that. That's what that's trying to tell you. And finally, you have the justification or the rationale. And what's the rationale for this? Well, for his power and his goodness are so great and incomprehensible that he orders and executes his work in the most excellent and just manner, even then when devils and wicked men act unjustly. Translation, because God is God. That's it. Because God is God, he can be the author of all things, but not be the author of all things, because he's God. That's that whole confession. That's the whole story. In the first part, they tell you that God authors the world in such a way that nothing happens in this world without his appointment. But at the same time, he's not the author. Now, how you can be the appointer of all things and not be the author, I don't know. But they have an answer, because he's God. That's the last part. Now, and so here you have the uncolored version of that whole confession. God makes everything happen, but he isn't responsible for the bad things because he's God. That's it. Now, it doesn't sound as pious as the Belgian confession, but that's the substance. There's zero things that happen in the world that God did not appoint to happen. But the bad things he didn't do. Why? Well, he's God. Now, a lot of people subscribe to that. They don't ask any further questions of that. They love the flowery language of the confessions, although I think it's a bunch of BS and nonsense. But a lot of people are okay with that. And Dave clearly seems to be all right. He thinks that that's an exact depiction of the way the world is, and we shouldn't ask questions about it. That's okay. Everybody's different. But I thought that that would have been a fantastic opportunity to dig into it, to see if Dave could see some of the things that I see. And I'm not telling him, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying as I analyzed it, as I dug into the details, that's what came out to me. An assertion that made God responsible and the author of evil, an assertion that God is not the author of evil, and the rationale that it's because he's God. That's what I got out of it. It would have been interesting to see what conclusions that they came to when they looked at it. Let's take a look at the last one. And this one was, I thought, more disturbing, or at least more frustrating for me than the one that we just went over. So what's going to happen here is Dave is going to bring up another quote from Calvin that Dave affirms. And I think what he's trying to do is, after all of the problematic, negative, or at least some people find very negative statements from Calvinists that he doesn't affirm, he's going to try and bring something from Calvin that he does affirm. Now, why I find this problematic is, again, when I saw this, I found there was something wrong with it, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But I don't think that they really made an attempt to dig into it because, well, take a look and you can see for yourself.
Pick a couple, and and I've made a couple of comments online, and then I said, this is what Calvin believes, and then people push back, well, he can't believe that because he also said this. Well, okay, are you looking at Calvin's quotes from a finite temporal view, or are you trying to understand the God's view of his whole creation? I think,
again, this is another appeal to mystery, that some people can see beyond into the mysteries and other people can't. And again, if you buy it, that's fine. But that's another appeal to mystery that often happens in Calvinism.
think that's where maybe the difference.
So in this clip, Dave is going to present something that he thinks is favorable that Calvin said, as opposed to all of the unfavorable things that he's heard Calvinist said, either that he has never heard before or just doesn't believe. He's going to present something that he thinks is favorable to Calvin.
Okay, so John Calvin. So faith is here. This is good. You're going to like this one. Faith is like an empty, open hand stretched out towards God, with nothing to offer and everything to receive.
Ooh, that's good.
That's John Calvin.
That's good. I like that.
So both of them sign on to it. Jordan, who's not a Calvinist, seems to love it. And obviously Dave thinks it's fantastic. He thinks that's a perfect example of faith. Let's listen. They go on.
Okay, that's good. That's what I heard growing up. That's what our faith is, right?
Okay, can you read that once more?
Yeah,
Dave.
So faith is like an empty, open hand stretched out towards God, with nothing to offer and everything to receive.
I like that. I'm going to use that. That's a great definition of faith.
How beautiful.
He says it's a great definition of faith. Dave thinks that that's what our faith is. Jordan says it's a great definition of faith.
How beautiful is that?
Yeah.
Right?
I tend to disagree. And here's why I disagree. I wasn't sure what I didn't like about it, and it could be just my, my bias. Because I have to acknowledge that I am biased. I think Calvinism is a bad idea. I think a lot of things that John Calvin wrote are complete nonsense. So I am more skeptical when these things pop up. I'm looking for the problem. So I don't want to even pretend like I'm some objective observer. I do have a position on this, and I think Calvinism is bad. So when I saw this, I thought, what's going on? That was my first impression. Here's the problem that I find. It's in the part where it says nothing to offer. I was asking myself, is that really the case? Does faith something that has nothing to offer? So, as always, when you have questions about these kinds of ideas, it's always good to go to the source, because what John Calvin is telling you and what Jordan seems to have signed on to and what Dave seems to clearly think is that is an accurate representation of faith. So they're holding up pictures. John Calvin, Jordan Hatfield, and Dave Vandervelde are holding up this picture of faith and saying it's an open hand with nothing to offer, an empty hand with nothing to offer. Well, let's look at the source, the thing that they are saying that this picture comes from, that this picture represents. So let's look at the representation. We have that available. So I'm just going to read a few verses, and this is in Matthew, that talk about faith. And you be your own judge. When I say judge, I mean you decide for yourself. You don't want to go by me. I'm no Bible teacher. Have no divinity school scholarship. I'm not a PhD in anything. I'm just some knucklehead who reads the Bible like most folks. But tell me if when I read these things, you get the picture of an empty hand with nothing to offer. So the first one is, this is the centurion. And some of you are going to be very familiar with this. When he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly." And he said to him, "I will come and heal him." But the centurion replied, "Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it." Now, this is the point. When Jesus heard this, he marveled. And I thought to myself, is Jesus marveling at an empty hand with nothing to offer? And he said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, no one in Israel have I found such faith." Now, that doesn't prove anything. It's just an impression. But when I read that, I don't think of an empty hand with nothing to offer. There's something there, because Jesus marveled at it enough to tell everybody around him, hey, look at this guy. Look at his faith. Doesn't seem like an empty hand with nothing to offer. Let's take a look at another one. This is down another chapter, chapter 9. We'll start in verse 20. This is a guy comes along, he's a ruler, and says, hey, my daughter is dead. Will you come and, bring her back to life? Which is fantastic, but that's not what we're going to be looking at here. In verse 20, it says, and behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood from 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will be made well. Okay. Jesus turned and seeing her said, take heart, daughter. Listen to this. Your faith has made you well. Does not sound like an empty hand with nothing to offer. Not to me. Again, I'm not doing the proof text things. I'm just saying as I read the Bible, I don't get the impression that Calvin's understanding of faith is a perfect description of faith. I reject that. It doesn't sound like that to me. Let's look at another one. In the very next paragraph, in the very next section, 2 blind men. And Jesus passed on from there. 2 blind men followed him, crying, have mercy on us, son of David. When he entered the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, do you believe that I'm able to do this? And they said to him, yes, Lord. Then he touched their eyes, saying, according to your faith, be it done to you. And their eyes were opened. Again, does not sound to me like an empty hand with nothing to offer. It sounds to me that there's something powerful about your faith in God. Here's another one. This is in, I think it's chapter 15, I think it is. Let me see if I can find it. There we go. Yeah, chapter 15, verse 21. It starts here in verse 21. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, have mercy on me, O Lord, son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, send her away, for she's crying out after us. And he answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came and knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me. And he answered, it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And she said, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Then Jesus answered her, O woman, great is your faith. Does not sound like an empty hand with nothing to offer. Be it done to you as you desire. Again, you make up your own mind. But when I read these verses, it sounds like John Calvin is a moron. This has nothing to do with faith, his statement. Another one. This one is also a familiar one to most folks. And when they came, this is verse 14, I'll start. And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to him and kneeling before him said, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he has a seizure and suffers terribly. For he often falls into the fire, often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him. That's key. And Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me. He sounds a bit irritated. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Now, then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why couldn't we cast it out? And this is what Jesus says. Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you had faith like the grain of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you because of your faith. I added that last part in, but that's the point. This sounds nothing like an empty hand. What it sounds like is if their faith was great, they could have healed that boy. That's what it sounds like to me. It doesn't sound like Jesus is saying, well, you've got an empty hand with nothing to offer anyway, so what does it matter? That's not what it sounds like. It sounds like what Jesus is saying is because of your little faith, you couldn't heal that kid. But if you had the faith, the grain of a mustard seed, you could move mountains. Nothing would be impossible to you. So, as I say, I'm no Bible scholar. I'm not here to tell you what to believe about the Bible or what John Calvin says. I'm not here to try to make you a Calvinist or a non-Calvinist. All that's up to you. All I'm saying is when people tell you things, when they say things, when they say, I believe this and this is the way the world is and I think this is fantastic. Sorry about that. I think it's a bad idea to go along with it because it sounds good. I think that's a big mistake, because if I'm correct and Jordan is going to run around telling people that their faith is like an empty hand with nothing to offer, I think he's telling people the wrong thing. That's just what I think. That's all I'm saying. Because far from this being an accurate understanding of what faith is, as it seems to me from reading the Bible, it's possible that this is nothing more than Calvinist propaganda. Now, why do I say that? Because if you're a Calvinist, Calvinism qua Calvin hates the idea that you can do anything on your own. They hate the idea that you could have faith that could heal someone, that could heal someone like the woman who had that 12-year blood disease. Calvin hates the idea that a person's faith could move a mountain. Calvin hates the idea that you could have faith that Jesus would marvel at, because they think that that means you're stealing glory from God. See, Calvinists have this big hang-up about who gets the glory. Does God get the glory? Are you stealing glory? And you'll hear some of the biggest Calvinists say, well, we give 100% glory to God, and they steal some of God's glory like God gives a rip. Because I got to be honest, in my experience, the only people who really cares about who gets the glory for something are the most insecure people. Just look around your own work. I know that's happened at my work. Something occurs and somebody's running up and go, hey, make sure you let everybody know that I did that. That's someone who's incredibly insecure, who's concerned about glory. And this is just my own personal feeling. I think that's the projection of the personality of Calvinists onto God. Because I don't think God gives a rip about who gets glory for what. God knows who he is, he knows who we are, and things should happen the way he's going to happen. I don't think glory is a big deal. But for a Calvinist, oh man, giving all the glory to God and stealing glory, they got pie charts and everything about how much glory you're getting and how much glory they're giving to him. And I think that's what this represents. This does not represent an accurate depiction of faith. I think this might be nothing more than just Calvinist propaganda trying to get you to the idea that you have nothing to offer. And again, this is just my reading of it. When you read these Bible verses, when I read the Bible verses, I'll just make it about me and not about what everybody should believe. When I read these Bible verses, I don't get the idea that we have nothing to offer. That's not the idea I get. I think that the proper way to understand it is that if we have faith in God, we have all kinds of power to move mountains, to heal people. Now, I've never moved a mountain or healed people. I'm not saying that. I'm just simply saying, I think the idea that Calvin has of faith is bunk. It's crap. That's what I think. And the only reason I think that is because I took the time to analyze it, to dig into the details. Now, you might disagree with me. You can go, Kev, you're thinking too much about it. It's just a nice little allegory, some sort of a poetic thing to say. Fine. That's fine. I'm a little different in that I only want to hear and repeat the things that have the most accuracy. Whether it sounds good or not, whether it makes me feel good to say it, is secondary. Primary is it an accurate depiction of the real world? And I think there's very little in Calvinism that does that. That's just my opinion. But my opinion is based on objective scrutiny of the details of their ideas. And if you don't do that, then yeah, maybe you might end up thinking too that your faith is nothing. You got nothing to offer. I just think that the Bible is a little bit different. But again, just my opinion. The only point I'm trying to make is When you have someone in front of you who is telling you this is the way the world is, it is your responsibility to go, hold on, let me look at it, let me think about it, and maybe I got to do some research before I sign on to it, and I'll get back to you. Might be a great idea. Might be perfectly accurate, but it might be problematic. But if you don't take the time to dig into the details, and it doesn't matter how small you think it is, it doesn't matter how insignificant you think it is, you should bring it as clear as possible. And the only way you can do that is by getting into the details. That's the only thing. All right, I'm rambling now. Thanks again for tuning in on The Colored. Please continue to give me your comments, your likes. And again, if you disagree, I'd love to hear that too, because again, I'm not getting everything. Your information is important for me to have. But I do appreciate your support. Please continue to watch. And if you have any suggestions of things that you would like me to talk about, please leave those in the comments. And again, I'll try and fit them in down the road. I've got this backlog of stuff that I'm trying to get out there, but eventually I will get to it. And that's it. Right, get out of here. That's enough out of me.